We like to think our brains are these amazing, super efficient machines, right? Just processing everything perfectly. But what if they've got these built-in quirks, almost like default settings that can sometimes, lead us astray without us even noticing?
That's exactly it. That's what we're diving into today. Cognitive biases. Think of them as these, unconscious, systematic ways our thinking goes off track, influencing our judgments, our decisions.
Little mental shortcuts that sometimes miss the mark.
Precisely. They can lead to these predictable mistakes.
Okay, and to help us unpack all this, we're digging into an AI analysis, cognitive bias, nature, impact, and mitigation. Looks like a really thorough source.
It is. And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to tackle that big question. Are these biases just unnecessary hindrances? Things we'd be better off without?
Or are they maybe more fundamental, part of the basic operating system, you could say?
Exactly. Are they just getting in the way, or are they actually, woven into how we think?
And just to be clear up front, we're talking cognitive biases here, right? Not logical fallacies.
Good point. Yeah. Fallacies are errors in how an argument is structured. We're focused on the thinking process itself, those inherent tendencies that can sometimes, trip us up.
Got it. So where did this whole field of study even begin? Who started looking into these mental quirks?
Well, the big push really came in the 1970s. You got the groundbreaking work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman.
Kahneman and Tversky, yeah. Thinking fast and slow.
That's them. Their research zeroed in on how we rely on these mental shortcuts, they called them heuristics, to make sense of things quickly.
Like rules of thumb.
Exactly. Usually super helpful, very efficient. But, and this is the key bit, they can also lead to predictable errors. Those errors are the cognitive biases.
Okay.
And their work, it totally shook up economics, led to behavioral economics, showing we're not always the perfectly rational decision makers classical economics thought we were.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're flooded with information constantly. Our brains have to simplify, right?
Yeah.
But are these shortcuts universal? Is my brain doing the same thing as someone, say, halfway across the world?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is, it's complicated. It's nuanced. On one hand, there's definitely evidence for some universal aspects. We see similar bias patterns popping up in lots of different cultures.
Just something fundamental.
Right, maybe linked to our shared cognitive architecture, or even evolutionary psychology suggesting some biases helped our ancestors survive. That quick jump scare reaction. Maybe a bias towards assuming danger.
Right, that fight or flight thing feels pretty hardwired.
Exactly, and maybe simpler things too, like preferences for certain simple rhythms in music, things like that seem basic.
Okay.
But, and here's the other side, there's also a ton of research showing real cultural differences, how biases show up, how strong they are, how often they influence us. That can vary.
Interesting. So culture plays a role. Can you give an example?
Sure. So researchers compare, say, Western cultures, often more individualistic, focused on objects with East Asian cultures, which tend to be more collectivistic, more sensitive to context.
Yeah.
And they find differences. Like one study suggested people in Hong Kong might interpret ambiguous things more positively, pay more attention to positive stuff, compared to people in the UK.
Wow. So where I grew up could literally affect whether I see the glass as half full or half empty subconsciously.
That's the idea, yeah. And it fits with other findings, like Westerners often showing stronger self-enhancement bias, seeing ourselves really positively, and maybe more optimism bias than East Asians, who might prioritize group harmony, maybe be more attuned to risks. And migration studies support this too. People move to a new culture, and sometimes their bias patterns can actually shift a bit over time, kind of aligning with the new environment.
That's wild. Our brains are culturally adaptable in a way. But how do researchers even study this stuff across cultures? This sounds incredibly tricky. It's like comparing cognitive apples and oranges.
You nailed it. It's a huge challenge. Cross-cultural cognitive research has major hurdles. First, you've got to make sure the thing you're measuring, say, confirmation bias, actually means the same thing and works the same way everywhere. Construct equivalence, they call it.
Right, like happiness might not translate perfectly.
Exactly. Then there's method bias. Maybe the way you ask questions works better in one culture than another. Group discussion versus individual survey, for example.
Okay.
And even item bias, a specific question or task, might just land differently depending on someone's background.
So you can't just translate a questionnaire and call it a day.
Definitely not. And Historically, psychology has had this big problem relying way too much on participants from weird societies.
Ew, weird.
Yeah, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So a lot of what we thought we knew about human cognition might actually be specific to that slice of humanity.
Right. Findings from U.S. college students might not apply universally. Makes sense.
Precisely. So while biases probably affect people across demographics, within culture, gender, intelligence, whatever, we still lack really solid data on exactly how common each bias is globally, across all groups.
And other things influence it too, like
Yeah.
mood.
Oh, yeah. Your
Oh,
emotional
yeah.
state, your motivations right now, social pressures, they all play a role. And interestingly, some biases, like loss aversion feeling, losses more than equivalent gains show up in animals too.
Really? Like monkeys.
Yeah, suggesting very deep biological roots. So the big picture. Fundamental mechanisms might be universal, tied to our basic brain wiring, but how they express themselves, that's heavily shaped by culture. We really need more research on diverse populations, much more.
Okay, so they're common, culturally influenced. But what's the actual, like, day-to-day impact? How do they mess with our lives?
Oh, the effects are huge. They ripple through everything. Individually, think of them like filters. They distort how we see reality, leading to these systematic judgment errors. Take the availability heuristic. Plane crashes get tons of news, right? Easy to recall. So we overestimate the risk compared to, say, car accidents, which are far more common but less dramatic. Our brain grabs the easily available memory.
Yeah, I've definitely felt more nervous about flying after seeing a crash on the news. Even though I know driving is statistically riskier, it's powerful.
It really is. Then there's anchoring bias. That first piece of info you get, it anchors your thinking, like the first price you see in a negotiation.
Right, sets the stage.
Exactly. All your later estimates tend to cluster around that initial anchor, even if it's totally arbitrary. And this biased judgment leads to decisions that aren't always, well, rational.
Like what?
Well, the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah,
Ever kept watching a terrible movie just because you're already an hour in?
guilty. Or finishing a meal you don't even like because you paid for it.
Exactly. You keep investing because you've already put resources in, even when logically you should cut your losses. Or status quo bias that pulled towards keeping things the same, even if change would be better.
Comforting, maybe?
Perhaps. And the framing effect is fascinating too. How you present the same information focusing on gains versus losses can completely flip the choices people make.
So it's not just the facts, but how they're packaged.
Precisely. And it doesn't stop there. Our memory, it's not a perfect recording, it's reconstruction.
Yeah.
And highly susceptible to bias.
How so?
Hindsight bias, I knew it all along. After something happens, we overestimate how predictable it was. Makes it
Right.
hard to learn from surprises.
Right.
Then the misinformation effect. New information coming in after an event can actually change your memory of the event itself. And consistency bias, we tend to remember our past selves, our past attitudes, as being more aligned with our current beliefs than they actually were.
So memory is constantly being rewritten in a way. Those good old days might be filtered through today's lens.
Very much so. And crucially, these biases aren't just about, everyday decisions. They connect to mental health too. Negative biases, focusing on the bad, interpreting things negatively, remembering failures are common in depression and anxiety. On the flip side, some positive biases, like maybe a touch of optimism, might actually help with resilience.
So these aren't just abstract concepts. They have real teeth affecting our emotions or well-being. What about when we zoom out? Society, groups.
Oh, the societal impacts are massive. Think about interactions. Actor-observer bias. My mistakes are situational. Your mistakes are your character flaws.
Class.
Halo effect.
Yeah.
Someone's good at one thing, we assume they're good at everything. Stereotyping.
Yeah.
Implicit bias.
Yes.
Huge drivers of prejudice and discrimination. In-group bias. Favoring our own group, naturally.
Leads to exclusion.
Can do. And in-group decisions. Groupthink. Everyone wants harmony, so critical thinking goes out the window. Leads to terrible decisions sometimes.
I think we've all seen that in meetings, where everyone just kind of nods along even if they have doubts.
That's the dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And these biases fuel bigger societal issues too. Polarization, for example. Confirmation bias, seeking out info that confirms what we already believe, plus naive realism, thinking we see things objectively, and dissenters are just wrong or biased.
Creates echo chambers.
Exactly. Online, in media choices. Plus the false consensus effect. We overestimate how many people agree with us. And things like illusory pattern perception, seeing patterns in randomness, and confirmation bias again. They prop up belief in pseudoscience, conspiracy theories.
Undermining trust in experts' institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, feels very relevant right now.
It is. And don't forget, economics. Biases blow up that idea of the perfectly rational economic actor, investor overconfidence, anchoring on prices, loss aversion making people hold on to bad investments, availability heuristic driving market panic based on recent news. It's all there.
Even science isn't immune, you mentioned.
Not at all. Researchers are human. Confirmation bias can lead them to favor data supporting their hypothesis. Status quo bias makes it hard for genuinely new, paradigm-shifting ideas to get traction. Publication bias, positive results get published, null results often don't, skews the whole picture.
So we might only be seeing part of the story.
Could be. There are even specific research biases, like arcing, hypothesizing after the results are known. Basically, fitting the story to the data, which isn't ideal science. That delay in accepting HLA antibodies in transplant rejection, a real-world example of how these things can slow vital progress.
It's kind of staggering. Personal choices, group dynamics, science, economics, they're everywhere.
They really are, even how we view history. Historians can have biases like presentism, judging the past by today's standards. Historical records themselves can be biased. And big historical decisions. Think Bay of Pigs, the Challenger disaster groupthink likely played a role, sunk cost fallacy keeping projects like the Concorde going long after they stopped making economic sense.
Okay, you've mentioned a lot of specific biases. The AI analysis we're using lists quite a few. Maybe we could walk through some key examples from that list just to nail down their impact.
Good idea. Let's take confirmation bias again. We talked about news consumption, science. It's that tendency to seek out and favor info that fits what we already think and downplay stuff that doesn't. Really pervasive.
Okay, what else?
Availability heuristic. We mentioned risk perception, fearing the rare plane crash more than the common car accident. It also hits economics market reactions based on vivid, easily recalled news, not necessarily the underlying data.
Right.
Anchoring bias, huge in negotiations, as we said. That first number sets the benchmark. Also affects how we judge prices generally. Hindsight bias, that knew-it-all-along effect, makes it harder to genuinely learn from mistakes, doesn't it? Because it feels like the outcome was obvious.
Yeah, you don't analyze what went wrong if you think you saw it coming.
Exactly. Status quo bias keeps us stuck with defaults in investments, software settings, even brand loyalty when switching might be better.
And that sunk cost fallacy, needing to finish the bad movie just because you started it, hits close to home.
Doesn't it? Then self-serving bias. Our successes, down to our skill. Our failures, bad luck, external factors. Makes teamwork tricky sometimes, and learning from failure harder.
I can see that.
Halo effect, judging a book by its cover, essentially. Good looking. Must be smart and kind, too. Impacts hiring, social interactions. Optimism bias, believing bad things are less likely to happen to us, can affect health choices, financial planning.
It won't happen to me.
Pretty much. Groupthink and in-group bias can lead to poor hiring decisions, lack of diversity, stifled innovation within teams. And finally, Dunning-Kruger effect. Really fascinating. People with low competence often overestimate their ability, while experts sometimes underestimate theirs.
So the less you know, the more you think you know. Wild. It's not just random mistakes then. It's these predictable patterns. Almost feels like our brains are wired wrong sometimes.
Well, that leads perfectly into the next big question, doesn't it? Why do we have these biases? Are they just bugs, system errors?
Yeah.
Or is there something deeper going on? Maybe even something adaptive?
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Are they flaws or are they actually features?
Evolutionary psychology offers a really compelling perspective here. It suggests our minds, like our bodies, were shaped by natural selection. Not for perfect logic, but for survival and reproduction in the environments our ancestors lived in.
The EEA, right, Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness.
Exactly. So from this view, biases might not be flaws in a logical sense, but maybe strategies or byproducts of strategies that actually helped our ancestors survive and pass on their genes.
So things that trip us up today might have been lifesavers back then.
That's the core idea. Evolution optimizes for fitness surviving, reproducing not necessarily for perfect accuracy by modern standards. Those heuristics, the mental shortcuts. Think fast and frugal. Quick decisions, incomplete information, limited processing power that was the norm ancestrally.
Makes sense. You don't have time for a full statistical analysis when there's a lion nearby.
Precisely. So even if these shortcuts lead to errors sometimes according to strict logic, they often produced good enough answers quickly in high-stakes situations. Some even argue hindsight bias might have helped update memory, even if it distorts perceived predictability.
So not just being wrong, but maybe a quirky way of learning from outcomes.
Could be. And then there's error management theory, or EMT. This is really cool. It suggests biases can evolve when the cost of different types of errors isn't symmetrical.
Meaning?
Okay, think about hearing a rustle in the grass. Error type 1. Assume it's a predator when it's just wind. False positive. Cost. Maybe some wasted energy, brief anxiety.
Right.
Error type 2. Assume it's wind when it's actually a predator. False negative. Cost. Potentially fatal.
Ah, I see. Much higher cost.
Exactly. So EMT argues selection would favor brains biased towards making the less costly error, even if it means making more errors overall. In this case, a bias towards assuming agency or threat.
Like a smoke detector that's a bit too sensitive. Better safe than sorry.
Perfect analogy. Other examples might involve avoiding contaminants, navigating social threats, mate selection. Even overconfidence might have pushed individuals to take necessary risks.
So biases as evolutionary trade-offs, sacrificing accuracy for speed or safety.
That's a great way to put it. But there's a catch. The mismatch hypothesis.
Okay.
Adaptations that worked great in the small-scale, immediate feedback world of the EEA might be poorly suited, even harmful in our modern world. Complex statistics, global finance, abstract long-term problems. Our ancestral toolkit might not be up to the job.
Our brains haven't had a software update for the modern world.
Pretty much sums it up. What helped us survive on the savannah might lead us astray in the stock market or when evaluating climate change data.
Okay, that evolutionary perspective is fascinating. What about the biology? Can we actually see links between biases and how our brains are built?
Absolutely. Neuroscience is digging into this. On a basic level, biases seem partly a consequence of the brain's processing limits. It just can't handle everything meticulously. So filtering, simplifying heuristics and biases are how it manages information overload, biologically speaking.
A necessary coping mechanism for a limited machine.
In a way, yes. And brain imaging lets us see which areas are involved. The amygdala, crucial for emotion, seems key in emotionally charged biases like quick reactions to outgroups. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's CEO for reasoning and control, tries to regulate these impulses.
So a constant tug of war between impulse and control.
Often, yes. Even specific areas like the part recognizing faces react differently to in-group versus out-group faces. Reward circuits light up more for in-group favoritism. And this understanding is leading to things like cognitive bias modification, CBM.
You mentioned that trying to retrain the brain.
Yeah, using computer-based exercises to try and shift those automatic responses, showing some promise, especially clinically for anxiety, depression biases. But it's early days, not a magic bullet for everything.
Still, the idea you could potentially rewire these pathways is hopeful.
It is. And neuroscience increasingly sees cognition not just in isolated spots, but emerging from vast interacting networks. Biased judgments arise from patterns of activity across these networks, shaped by learning, emotion, context.
So it's all interconnected.
Deeply. This network view, plus the evolutionary arguments, plus the System 1, System 2 thinking distinction, fast intuition versus slow deliberation, really pushes back against seeing biases as just flaws. They seem like deeply embedded features of how we're built.
It's amazing how different fields look at this. What about, say, philosophy or logic? How do they frame cognitive bias?
They bring crucial perspectives. Philosophy grapples with rationality itself. Biases are often defined by how they deviate from philosophical or logical standards of good reasoning. Philosophers contrast that ideal, perfect rationality with bounded rationality. Acknowledging our real-world cognitive limits mean we have to use heuristics that can lead to bias. They also look at theoretical rationality, justifying beliefs, versus practical rationality, justifying actions. Do evolved biases always count as irrational if they serve a past purpose?
So rational for survival might not be rational in a logic textbook.
Exactly. Epistemology, the study of knowledge, looks at how biases like confirmation bias, belief perseverance, sticking to beliefs despite contrary evidence, Dunning-Kruger, how they undermine our ability to form accurate beliefs and know our own limits. They fuel misinformation.
Makes sense.
Logic and math provide the formal systems to measure these reasoning errors. Confirmation bias can lead straight to the logical fallacy of cherry-picking evidence. Many biases are fundamentally errors in probability, availability, base rate neglect, gambler's fallacy. Tversky and Kahneman called it innumeracy, our intuitive struggles with statistics.
Right.
And even biology and physics offer angles. Biology gives the rationale for heuristics, brain limits. Network theory from physics helps model how biases spread socially or arise in neural nets. Embodied cognition suggests our physical state affects judgments.
Wow, it touches everything.
The key thing is, biases are often defined against these normative standards logic. probability, which creates that tension with the evolutionary view of adaptive rationality. You really need all these lenses to get the full picture.
It really drives home the complexity. So,
Yeah.
given they're so ingrained, so multifaceted, what can we actually do about them? Can we mitigate the negative impacts?
Yes, thankfully there's a lot of work on debiasing strategies. It ranges from individual techniques to broader systemic changes.
Okay, where do we start individually?
Often just awareness and education. Simply knowing these biases exist and how they might affect you is a crucial first step.
Just knowing isn't enough, though, right?
Usually not, but it's foundational. Then come cognitive strategies. Things like consciously taking other perspectives. Actively considering the opposite of your initial thought. They call it devil's advocacy sometimes. Reframing a problem. Intentionally slowing down your thinking. Resisting that first gut reaction. Mindfulness can help too, becoming more aware of your thoughts and feelings as they happen.
So deliberately engaging that slower, more effortful System 2 thinking to check the fast, intuitive System 1.
Exactly. You can also use structured decision-making tools. Pros and cons lists, sure, but also things like pre-mortem analysis. Imagine the project failed. Now brainstorm why. Frameworks like De Bono's 6 thinking hats force you to look from different angles. Blind data analysis helps in research.
Taking the bias out by removing identifying information.
Right, and seeking diverse input is huge. Talk to people with different backgrounds, different views. Structured intergroup contact, positive interactions between different groups can reduce prejudice too.
And the CBM you mentioned, the computer training.
Yes, cognitive bias modification. Trying to retrain those automatic associations. Still developing, but shows promise for specific biases, especially in clinical settings like anxiety. And finally, there's nudging, changing the environment.
Choice architecture, like making the healthy option the default.
Precisely. Setting defaults, providing feedback, framing choices differently to steer people towards better outcomes without forcing them. Okay, lots of strategies, but how well do they actually work? Are there limits?
Oh, definitely limits. It's hard. These patterns are ingrained, often unconscious. Awareness alone rarely cuts it. Many strategies take real mental effort, motivation, practice. Training might not transfer well to new situations, or the effects might fade. Nudging has limits too. Effects can be short-term. People might resist if they feel manipulated, reactance, and there are ethical questions about autonomy.
So we can't just rely on willpower or simple tricks? Not really. Which is why systemic approaches are vital. Building bias resistance into organizations. Promoting diversity. Standardized protocols for decisions like hiring. Creating cultures where critical thinking is valued, where it's okay to challenge assumptions. Changing incentives, like rewarding reproducible science, including null results.
Making the system itself less prone to bias.
Exactly. Often the best strategies interrupt the link between the bias and a bad outcome, structuring the decision process, shaping the environment rather than trying to eliminate the bias itself, which might be impossible. And different biases probably need different approaches. It's about a multi-layered strategy, individual, group, and system level.
This has been incredibly insightful, a real deep dive. So let's come back to that core question. Unnecessary hindrances or fundamental features. Where do we land after all this?
Okay, let's recap quickly. Biases. Systematic thinking errors, born from mental shortcuts. Universal roots, but culturally shaped. Huge impacts, individual, societal, historical. Evolutionary views suggest they might be adaptive strategies from our past. Neuroscience shows biological underpinnings. Other fields define them against logical ideals. Ethics worries about harm, manipulation. Debiasing is possible, but challenging.
Right, so that unnecessary hindrance side of the argument.
Well, the evidence is strong, isn't it? Suboptimal decisions, resistance to change, slowing science, historical blunders, prejudice, medical errors. The list of negative consequences is long. From the perspective of achieving rational outcomes and progress in today's world, their impact often seems deeply detrimental and, unnecessary in that sense.
But then there's the other side, the necessary feature argument.
Exactly. The evolutionary and cognitive views frame heuristics, the source of bias, as essential for managing complexity with limited brainpower. EMT suggests survival advantages. They seem wired into our neural architecture, maybe inseparable from how we think. From that angle, they're features, part of the design spec, not easily removable bugs.
Flaw or feature, it sounds like. Both.
That feels like the most accurate synthesis, yes.
Sure.
They aren't purely one or the other. They're deeply ingrained aspects of how we think, likely born from evolutionary trade-offs. Features that served us well in the past, but often manifest as flaws or bugs in our complex modern environment that mismatch idea again.
So unnecessary in their negative consequences now, but necessary as part of our current cognitive toolkit.
I think that captures the tension well. We seem to be stuck with these biased minds in a fundamental way.
So what's the takeaway? If we can't just get rid of them,
It seems the path forward isn't about eliminating bias that won't be unrealistic, but about cultivating awareness, managing the impact, fostering critical thinking individually and systemically, and designing our world, our systems, to be more resilient to our inherent irrationalities. Continuing research, especially cross-culturally, is vital. It's about acknowledging our biased nature and striving for wiser judgment anyway.
that's a really powerful conclusion. Cognitive biases, complex, fundamental, potentially problematic. Maybe progress isn't about overcoming them completely, but understanding them so well we can build systems and societies that work with our biased minds, aiming for better collective outcomes despite individual imperfections. Something for all of us to think about as you go through your day. Just notice your own thinking. Where might these patterns be showing up for you? It's a constant, fascinating journey.
This is DigitView.